The next thing is we have to look at certain React component lifecycle methods. What do you mean by a component lifecycle? Say you are having a class component that you are creating, and this component goes through a life cycle. That is, first this component will be initialized, and then it will be mounted, and then whenever changes happen, the component will be updated, and finally the component will be unmounted or removed from the DOM. So what do you mean by mounting it? It is mounted to the DOM, and when any props or state changes, that component will be updated. That will be the updating phase. Finally, the component can be unmounted from the DOM. So there are certain methods that run through the life cycle of a component. So you can think of the life cycle of a component to contain these phases, that is initialization phase, mounting phase, updating phase, and unmounting phase. So these are the phases that define the life cycle of a component. And during each of these phases, we have certain methods that will execute. So you have a class, right? So inside this class, you'll have certain methods. I'll call this method 1, method 2, method 3, method 4. When the class is in the initialization phase, when the component reaches the initialization phase, maybe the constructor of the class runs. When the component is mounted, when it is in the mounted phase, maybe method M1 runs. When it is updated, maybe method M3 runs. When it is unmounted, we need to clear the subscription, the feed, all those things, then the method M4 runs. So what is that we understand with respect to React component lifecycle methods is a component goes through several phases after its creation. It may get initialized, then mounted, updated, and finally unmounted. So this is called the component lifecycle phases. And during each phase, there are certain methods that will run when it is in that specific phase. So as I told you, when it's initialized, when it's in the initialization phase, the constructor may run and then it will initialize the state variables. And when it is in the mounted phase, certain methods will run and then it will take care of the activities in the mounted phase. Likewise, updated, when the props or the state change, whether the component should be updated or not, that kind of a decision will be made and methods will run. And unmounted phase, when you are unmounting a component from the DOM, then certain methods will run finally. So these are called React component lifecycle methods. So we'll see some of the methods in the React component lifecycle. So what are lifecycle methods? That allow you to perform actions at different stages or phases of a component's existence. What are the phases we have seen? I told you mounting, updating, unmounting. So these are the phases, and during these phases, there are certain methods that will run that are available within a class-based component that will perform certain actions at different stages of a component's existence. So in the mounting phase, I told you there will be initialization happening. So we'll have a constructor that will run. It's an optional thing. So constructor you can have for a class, and this will be used for initializing the state. So initialization of the state happens using a constructor during the mounting phase. And component did mount is another lifecycle method. As I told you, I was just telling you M1, M2, M3. So you have component did mount. When the component is added, inserted to the DOM, this method will execute. And there are other optional methods like get snapshot before update. Before you actually update the component in the updating phase, you can get a snapshot. You can capture the DOM information before it's updated using get snapshot before update. Get derived state from props. So this method updates state based on changes in props. So all these methods are optional. So let's not dive into these methods. Let's take a look at component did update. So this is called after the component updates in the DOM. Perform actions based on state or prop changes here. So when a component updates, this method is called after the component updates, and the certain actions can be performed based on the state or prop changes. So these are some of the lifecycle methods, and we are looking at the updating phase. In the mounting phase, we have seen the constructor can be used for initializing the state, and component did mount will be used for, can be called immediately after the component is inserted, whereas component did update can be called after the component is updated. And we also have the unmounting phase. What is this phase? This is the phase wherein you will remove the component from the DOM. So once when the component is removed from the DOM, this method will execute component will unmount. And this is mostly a cleanup method, clean up subscriptions and event listeners to prevent memory leaks. So these are the phases, and during each and every phase, we have certain lifecycle methods that will execute, and these lifecycle methods are part of your class. So I'll just give an sample code here. So we have a class counter that extends React component. So this is our class component, class counter. And as I told you, see, it can have a constructor which will run to initialize the state. And this is coming under the mounting phase. You can call that to be the initialization phase too. The mounting or the initialization can happen using the constructor wherein we initialize the state. And component did mount, I was telling you about this method. This method will run immediately after the component is inserted in the DOM. So you can have a set of actions here. And component did update. So this method is part of the update phase. So sorry, let me clear this. Pointer options, areas all link on the slide. So what is this component did update method? That is the method that will run in the updating phase. So once when there is a change with respect to the state or with respect to the props, a decision can be made to update the component. So immediately after the update happens to the component, this method will run. And we also have this method component will unmount. This method will be executed once when the component is removed from the DOM. So class can contain all these lifecycle methods which will execute during the various uh, phases of the component's lifecycle. Are you clear with the lifecycle methods? We are not going to focus on all these methods with respect to its implementation. We'll focus on the use of a constructor and how this constructor can be used for maintaining state within a class component. So let's take a look at that specific thing. The next concept we're going to take a look at is use of state with React class components. So as I told you, state is actually initialized during the state variables are initialized using the mounting phase. And as I told you, a constructor can be used for initialization of the state variables. So let's take an example. Let's understand how state is used with React class components. Let's take a look at this specific code. So we have our class which extends the React class component. And here comes the constructor. We all know what a constructor is. It runs for a class, right? So constructor, and the first statement is super. Super will be passing the props to the component class constructor. So that is the super class. The super class for my class is component class. So super of props is we are passing the props to the component class. So that's a standard. We'll not worry about this. So you should have some object-oriented programming knowledge to understand what is super. Say if you have known super keyword in Java, it's the same thing. Like you pass the props to the superclass constructor. So this is our focus today. So this dot state. So you have a state object here, this dot state, and we have a count variable initialized to 0. So here we are having this state of count. So there is a variable wherein that is initialized to 0, and this is privately maintained within this class. So this state variable is maintained within this class, and it is initialized to 0. So how you access this variable is this dot state, and then you initialize that to 0. The next thing is how to update the value for count. So count is a state variable. So if you want to update the value for count, you should use this method called setState. So that is, there is a method which we have to use whenever you're working with the state variable. So how is that we are using this method? For this, we have a button. When I click this button, I am having this handle click, which is an event handler. So on click, I am calling this function handle click. And there is also a paragraph element which actually displays the count value. So how will you access this count values? You use this dot state dot count. So that's how you access it in a class component. So this dot state dot count initially will be 0. So here the number of clicks initially will be 0. So that will be the output. And once when the user clicks this, this event handler runs. And what's happening inside the event handler is handle click, and we are accessing this dot set state. I told you this state variable can be manipulated only using the set state method. And how is that you're changing the value? This dot state dot count plus 1 is assigned to count. So every time the user clicks this, count will be incremented by 1. So there are two things you should understand here. One is a constructor is used wherein we define the state object. So how you access the state object is this dot state is equal to whatever variables you want to maintain. You can give that as count colon 0. So here I have one state variable wherein the initial state of that is 0. And the second thing you have to understand is whenever you want to manipulate a state variable, you have to use this method set state in a class component. So here set state is called within an event handler. So once when somebody clicks, this method is called, and this method will in turn invoke the set state method and increment the count by 1 and assign it to the count variable. So a state variable is something that is maintained within the class component, and it can be changed within the component. So let's try and execute this. Let's see what will be our output. So let's go to our first class component which you have created. We'll modify it to include this code. So here we have our first class component which we have already coded. It's a class component. Now let us change this class component to manage state as we have seen on the slides. So what is that we are going to have here is we are going to have a constructor to manage the state variable. So it's going to initialize the state variable. So constructor will be receiving some props. So constructor is nothing but the method that will run to initialize the state variable. So the first statement is a super method call which will pass the props to the super class called the component class. Let's not worry about this much. Let's move to the state management. So we access the state object by saying this dot state, and here we're going to have this variable count which will be initialized to 0. So this dot state, we are managing a variable within the component, and the state of the variable is it's initialized to 0. And how you manage this variable? We are using this dot state. And next what we are going to do is we are going to have a button which the user will click. So let's have a button, and on click what we are going to perform is we are going to call this method this dot handle click, which is the event handler, And on this button, we are going to say click here. And we'll also have a paragraph element which says how many times the button was clicked. Say the button was clicked, and you can access this specific state variable using this dot state dot the variable name count times. So we have initialized that in the constructor. The value will be 0. So the button was clicked 0 times will be the initial value for this variable. Now when the user clicks on this button, an event occurs and this event handler is called. How is that you're going to manipulate a state variable? You're going to use the setState method within the event handler. So let's code this event handler, that is handle click. It's an arrow function, and what is that we are going to perform inside this event handler? This dot set state. So we should be using this method set state to manipulate the state variable. And what is that value we'll be assigning for counters? We'll access this dot count, this dot state dot count plus 1. So this dot state dot count, that will be the actual count of that variable. So if it is 0, it will be incremented as 0 plus 1, and the count will be moving on to 1. So what is that we are using here is we are using set state to actually manipulate this state variable. So this is part of the syntax. That is, when the user clicks, we are having an event handler, but then we should be calling set state to actually manipulate the state. And how is that you're initializing the state? We are initializing that using the constructor, and the variable is initialized to 0. So first initialization, next manipulation of that variable using set state. So that's it. Let's go to index.js. Let's remove all the props we have passed. Let's save this. Let's take a look at the output. The button was clicked 0 times. Why it is 0? Because the initial state of that variable is 0. So once when we click, this dot set state will be called, and then the count will be incremented by 1. So let's take a look at the demonstration now. So now you see here 1, 2, 3. So whenever we click, the event handler comes in and set state increments the value of this variable by 1. So that's how you manage state within a class component. I hope you are clear with this. So what is that we have seen here is how to manage state within the class component. So we have seen a lot of things with respect to class components. The first thing is how to create a simple class component and return a simple UI. The next thing what we have seen is how to pass props, how props work with class components. So we have passed some props and we have rendered the components. And the third thing is we have looked at the component lifecycle. A class component has got a life cycle. It goes through these phases: mounting, wherein we'll initialize using constructors. We also have some methods corresponding to that. We have the updating phase, wherein when the component is updating, certain methods will be called after it's updated. And the third phase is the unmounting phase. Once when the component is removed from the DOM, certain methods will be called. So we'll be running certain methods when the component is inserted into the DOM, that falls under the mounting phase. When the component is updated, certain methods will be called, that falls under the updating phase. And the component is removed from the DOM, certain methods will be called, that comes under the unmounting phase. So we call all these methods as React lifecycle methods, and we have seen all those lifecycle methods. And finally, we have seen how to manage state in the mounting phase. So we've taken a state variable called count, and we have manipulated this using the method setState. We have taken a demo and we have understood this. So this understanding is very important, because next we'll be moving on to React hooks, wherein we'll understand how to manage state within function components like we manage state within class components. Anyway, that's it for now. Take care.